Yeah, what do you say to someone who has been in the gym for perhaps months or even many years, but have never followed a structured program? You just kind of go, you kind of maybe do a bicep day, maybe do a chest day, but you're just kind of, I wouldn't say goofing around, but you're not really following any sort of structure. For someone like that, how should they assess whether they're a novice, intermediate, or perhaps even advanced? I'm guessing not advanced, but how should they assess that to find the optimal program for them?
Yeah, I think well, philosophically, the question I asked them, because if I was to myth bust or fix every problem I came across, I would just be an asshole, and not every problem necessarily needs to be solved. Um, when I encounter someone who's doing something that I probably don't think is ideal, the question I often ask is, "How's that working for you?" Because ultimately, some things might be good enough. So if someone is just following an unstructured approach and they're like, it's good, man. I make progress every time I go to the gym and I repeat this, then I go, awesome, carry on. Like I'm not going to fix if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But what it typically and eventually happens is they hit a plateau. They reach the constraints of what their genetics and natural environment can produce by kind of winging it. And at that point, then you do have to do exactly what you described. You want to assess what is the current level they're at to match them with the right approach. And I think a lot of the content out there does a disservice to people with trying to figure out whether they're novice, intermediate, or advanced because it gives these like arbitrary like weights. Like, oh, a 315 squat is good, a 2 plate bench is good, and a 4 plate deadlift that's good. And it's like, yeah, are we talking about like 5'8" to 5'10" males only? Like, like I don't understand who are apparently focused on the squat, bench, and deadlift. Like it's a very, very narrow band of people. Yet it seems to be like the dominant way of talking about this, right? So what do you do if you're 5'1" female who's interested in getting better at pull-ups? Like that's not helpful to you at all, right? Um, so I think a much better and more accurately aligned way of looking at it is assessing the rate you can progress rather than these arbitrary numbers. And another reason is that some people are just dealt a shitty hand or an amazing hand out the gate. For example, I think there's a story that Andy Bolton, who is used to be a world record deadlift holder out of the UK, the first time he ever deadlifted, he pulled 500 or 600 pounds, right? So that means the first time he
Yeah,
trained,
that's okay.
it's all right. Yeah, yeah. So he is a beginner, right? That is by definition, he's just beginning to lift weights. Yet he's deadlifting 100, 200 pounds more than what we would consider someone who is late stage, intermediate or advanced. So it's not helpful because for him, what does that mean? Just train once a week and do whatever the hell you want, and it's fine because you're stronger than everybody else. Well, no, like this guy wanted to get his deadlift as high as it could, and he had another 400 to 500 pounds he could add on. He almost doubled his deadlift, and that went on to become a world record holder. He needs to know that for him, a 700-pound deadlift or an 800-pound deadlift is intermediate, even though it's completely out of reach for 99.9% of the population ever, right? So these absolute numbers, or even sometimes body weight multipliers, are far less helpful than something like what is your rate of progress that you can sustain. So the way I try to describe it, which I think it's imperfect, but it's still more helpful, because whether or not you're seeing progress isn't only dependent upon your training age, but if all else is held equal, and assuming you're following a program that's working for you, you can assess things like, are you able to make progress on a session to session basis? Like it's every time you go in and do bicep curls, or probably a better example would be a compound exercise. Can you add some weight to the bar or do another rep? Okay, you're probably a novice, intermediate, can you do that on like a weekly basis? And that's where most programs kind of assume like what a plateau is. Like last week I benched 100, this week I couldn't bench 105. Like, oh, something's wrong. And when that's happened on the majority of exercises and it's happened repeated for a couple weeks, that's when you start head scratching and you think of changing your program. But at the advanced level, like I mentioned, if you have to put together multiple blocks of training to then test to see if perhaps you've gotten stronger, or you have to compete, or you have to assess things like, what is my estimated 1RM based upon me training at a high proximity to failure? So I think I did a single at a 9 RPE, or one rep from failure. And then, okay, what is that? Is that higher than last time I did a single? Or what is my estimated 1RM from that? That's when you're advanced. So when someone comes to me, I ask a lot of questions, or if someone is trying to do this on their own, I encourage them to look at their training history, what was going on before they were plateaued, how quickly were they able to adapt. And so long as someone is following like a reasonable approach and they're not like constantly trying to diet, and they've been kind of in the general realm, a lot of the times they end up being late stage novices or intermediates. And that's where they run into a roadblock where with whatever approach they've been trying is not sufficient. Not always, though. Sometimes you run into people who are pretty savvy and push themselves pretty far, and they are actually stuck in a sea of intermediate programs, which is what makes it most of online. And they need something that is more advanced. They might need to hire a coach. So yeah, it really comes down to what's the rate that if things are set up in a decent way, can you progress? And that's why you can have some lifts that are novice, some lifts that are intermediate. You can have some body parts that are novice, some that are intermediate. There's a ton of dudes who I've talked to who started benching out the gate, did bicep curls at the gate, and then they jumped on squats, and they're like working on getting their squat up to their bench. So their bench is progressing slowly, but they're a novice when it comes to squat. Happens all the time. And so it's not just something that
actually.
We won't tell anyone. I won't tell on you.
I want to cut this
so
out.
it's yeah, there you go. We'll edit this out. But that's a common thing. So it's something that needs to be applied with a bit of nuance. But I think the general principle of what's the possible rate of progress, your best guess at it, is going to be the most indicative factor as to whether you should be following a novice, intermediate, or advanced approach.